So, Wallace and I initially went into Wandsworth Prison in April 2017. I mean, the reason we were there was to carry out a digital storytelling project with the men. We were working with a charity called Stretch, which, to my knowledge, is the only external organisation that has been authorised in the UK to take digital equipment, broadcast equipment, into prisons. There's a huge issue around digital infrastructure in prisons and the lack thereof, and the fact that people who are in prison are falling further and further behind in terms of being able to access digital provisions and services when they come out of prison. Now that so much of our day-to-day life is mediated through the internet and digital services. So you'll have people in prison who don't know how to use the internet, who don't know how to access the Department of Work and Pensions, social services, or whatever basic government information services they need to access, which has to happen online. So so that was one reason for us going in there with the digital equipment. The other reason was to work around storytelling with prisoners. And while that might sound a little bit frilly and unnecessary, in fact, storytelling in a prison context takes on quite significant proportions. When you're caught up in the criminal justice cycle, everything comes down to story. Everything comes down to who told your story. Did you tell your story in the best way possible? Is the story that's being told about you true? And the story that has been told about you, the story that has been circulated, is the story that means you are now in prison. So everything is very much about story and who has control of your story. So many times when we would work with individuals who were in prison, they had never had the opportunity to really think about their lives in any kind of context, to think about actions that maybe led to certain kinds of consequences, maybe never had the time or the opportunity to think about the sort of cycles, the narrative cycles they were in terms of the stories they were telling themselves in their own heads. And so being able to have the opportunity to really talk and tell your story in a way that isn't judged or mediated by someone else was actually a really powerful therapeutic tool, and I would say absolutely crucial to effective rehabilitation. Getting digital equipment into prisons is a huge issue. Like I say, we were working with the only charity that has so far been sanctioned to do that. The issue when we came to working at Wandsworth Prison, after many months of work, was that after we'd made all the films and done some incredible work with the men, and they'd made some very challenging stories and been amazingly honest and committed to the whole process, is that we weren't allowed to bring the films out. And in fact, we were actually instructed to delete the films under supervision before we could bring any of our equipment out, which was understandable in many respects. There's a huge amount of pressure on the prison service. They're under huge pressure from the media, concerned all the time that they're going to be accused by the media of not punishing X individual sufficiently, or doing something else, or unable to cope with the loads on the prison network. There's all sorts of reasons why the prison, the HMPPS, are highly sensitive to any kind of censure to any kind of scrutiny by the press or any other agencies. And this was a major reason why they did not want us to bring the films out. And I think that's a huge issue in its own right. If we stop to think about the fact that the criminal justice service or system, to what extent that is governed by media dictates, in a sense. But anyway, we couldn't bring the films out, which was devastating to everyone involved, to Wallace and I, who'd worked so hard with the men. And we'd promised them that we would be able to bring these films out, and that we would be able to not only share these stories with a wider audience. Some of them didn't want that. Some of them just wanted their friends and family to be able to hear a story that perhaps they'd never been able to share before. And we obviously felt that we'd let them down. And after much soul searching, we decided that we had to find another way to bring these stories to a wider audience, because they were meant to be brought out of the prison. They weren't meant to stay there. And so after negotiating with HMP Wandsworth, we have been allowed to bring out the transcripts of the stories as they were told, as on the proviso that we did not identify the men in any way directly. And so we're obviously grateful to HMP Wandsworth for allowing us to do that. Wallace and I spent a lot of time thinking over how we were going to work with the narratives that we'd brought out of the prison, and whether indeed we even had the right to use these stories in any way. Ultimately, we decided that the stories had been entrusted to us. They were born out of a process that we were all a part of, and that we shared, and we the bond that we developed with the men that we were working with in the prison is something that we also feel important about it. Feel strongly about honouring that. Wallace is an artist, I'm a writer, so we've worked together to work on the best way that we can bring those stories to a wider audience. We really want as many people as possible to see this book, and beyond that we hope to go on and do more of this kind of work, because we believe there are so many people in prison who have so much potential that's not being tapped, and not only do they have talents that they should be encouraged to develop while they're in prison, that perhaps they've never had the opportunity to develop before. And I believe there are a lot of highly creative and interesting people in prison that the whole of society would benefit from actually hearing some of the things that they've got to say. The book that we're developing and that we're hoping to bring to a wider audience is called Wings. The reason why we called it Wings is normally when you work in a prison, you might work in the education block or some sort of special area that's specially for that learning activity or whatever external activities taking place. But we spent an extraordinary amount of time actually on the wings, so actually in the areas where the prisoners live. We saw a huge amount that we were given really privileged access for one reason or another. I'm not quite sure how that came to pass, but we spent a lot of time on the wings, on different wings, and seeing a lot of what goes on behind the scenes in a prison, and also being able to experience the architecture inside Wandsworth Prison, which is extremely grand and also strange and confusing and disorientating, so that was the first reason why we called it Wings, because the idea of being on this wing or that wing, and the kind of confusion between the wings was very much part of our process being there. It was also, of course, the idea of taking flight and a sort of phoenix rising from the ashes idea, because a lot of these men had come to us at a time when they'd almost died to the outside world in a sense, and there was a kind of sense that they'd had a lot of time to think about why they were in there and how their lives had ended up in this place, and that there was a possibility towards perhaps flight. The other thing that was very noticeable when we went inside the middle of Wandsworth Prison and in the centre of the wings, because all the wings kind of branch out from a central atrium, which is hexagonal, and you can see right up to the ceiling, which is glass at the top, and there are hexagonal metal grates between the floors, so you can see right the way through each floor up to the top, through all these little honeycombs, and the whole interior of the 19th century part of the building is premised on what appears to be beehives, and as if the whole idea was that people could be housed in there like bees, productively, like little bees in a hive, And strangely enough, there were actually some real beehives that were brought into the prison yard while we were there. There was a beekeeping project was actually happening. Obviously, the bees could escape. The bees could fly over the barbed wire walls. The men couldn't. But there was this theme around the sort of honeycombs and the bees and the wings, and the idea of not physical escape, but the idea of a sort of transcendental escape in a way. And I know that maybe sounds a bit strange, but definitely a lot of the men that we came into contact with, there was a real spiritual aspect of the kind of conversations that they might have, and the sense of almost their soul could be lifted from this place, and into a different kind of reality, which I think is really interesting. It's perhaps not the kind of thing that you associate with people who might be in a category B prison in the south of London. So that's the kind of idea that was feeding the whole project, and feeding Wings, is trying to convey that real depth that we came into contact with when we were working with these men. You know, these weren't shallow people. They had some really interesting ideas. They were really deep in many ways, and so we decided to crowdfund this project. And if you've never come across crowdfunding before, you've never come across Kickstarter, which is the platform that we're using, what that means is, instead of us finding the money or finding the money out in our own pockets, or from a sponsor to pay to have these books printed and then hope that people will buy the book after, it means that people will pledge in advance for a copy of the book, or a piece of artwork. Wallace is producing all the artwork for the book, and that money will enable us to put the book together, get it professionally printed and distributed, and then ultimately, hopefully, go on and do more projects that are similar beyond that, and try to extend what we've done here and take it into other prisons and other communities. So that's what happens. So if people pledge, and we really hope that they will, and we, as far as we know, there's not been a book like this produced before. If they support our project, that means that we can make this happen, and we hope that by doing so we will be opening up a dialogue about the kinds of people that are in prison, and the way that we use prison in our society, and the way that we talk about prison in society. That's what we hope to do.